Hello, everyone who's already here. I think we will wait for at least 1 minute. Let everyone arrive. Hello, Ohad. Nice to see you. Nice to see everyone who's here, actually. It's all friends and family. Okay. Hi. I think this is a good moment to start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Even though it's such a beautiful weather outside. I'm Lou. I'll give a short introduction of this issue, which we're very excited to finally launch. It was a long process in the making. And then afterwards, we will go over to the presentations of the four speakers who could join us today. Thank you so much, Jeppe, Susanna, David, and Ayub for being here. And then we will have a brief discussion, which is also open. So please, if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or ask them in the chat. Standard procedure. Okay. So when we wrote the call for paper in 2019, can't believe it, we asked our authors to conceptually probe and poke contamination beyond its most common biomedical definitions. Contamination is extremely versatile. It possibly refers to a myriad of things, states, actions, and places. It can function as an ordering system as much as a bordering category denoting a non-place, corrupted, inaccessible, dangerous. This again can create ground for mystery and speculation, making us curious about which magical wonders or monstrous being are lurking beyond the fence. When something is declared to be contaminated, there is usually a regulative kind of hygiene regime on the other side, impelling you to wash your hands, purge the surfaces of the goods you're buying, and clean them of all germs and bacteria. This is inherently bound to an anthropocentric perspective. But hazardous for who or what is the question posed by the many plants, fungi, and animal species flourishing in the abandoned zones, which are deemed uninhabitable, at least for humans at least. When we wrote the call these many months ago, the objects on our minds were things like the tear gas used against demonstrators from Chile to Hong Kong, artistic critiques of Monsanto modified crops, the porosity of skin, or the beautiful noctilucent cloud sightings, which likely testify to an increased atmospheric methane pollution. Little did we know at the time how the unfolding events of a global pandemic would alter our everyday lives. I'm quoting you from the foreword. What first seemed like a distant event taking place elsewhere soon came to be a local reality, seeping into our relationships, workflow, mobility, and of course, our bodies. This certainly amplified the urgency to rethink contamination. Yet, the state of urgency also made and still makes it hard to argue for a critical, creative, or future-oriented thinking with contamination, as the comfortable distance with which we tend to exercise our methods of analyzing culture has become an unaffordable illusion, even for the most privileged scholars. Yet contamination also denotes a togetherness, an inevitability of contagion, of coming into touch with others, surfaces, things, and foods we share with our loved ones, our chosen or accidental flatmates, like the mice in my kitchen. It entails a constant weighing of risk, which we have become so accustomed to in life under lockdown. Risk does not only mean hazard or that which is to be avoided, but to risk also means to venture, to dare to move on. Risk-taking is never a one-way street, though. Life and love in times of COVID-19, that's so kitschy, is a constant balancing act between the dependence on and the resistance to governmentality, a social responsibility to isolate and the desire for collaboration, a collaboration that is necessary to survive. In the unfolding of COVID-19, it has become clear that those who are most affected by and most vulnerable to involuntary contamination is not an accident. There are patterns, histories, and systematic structures in place, alerting us that any discussion of contamination harbors a political question. In their articles, our four authors carefully consider the questions of power. When does collaboration turn into corruption? Hybrid subjects transform until their parts become unrecognizable. What is at stake in differentiating between nurture and appropriation, the fake and the authentic? So without further ado, I want to give the word to Susanna Fabre, to briefly, maybe you can tell us from where you're speaking and then go on with your presentation.
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Susana. I'm originally from Mexico, and I have been living in Doha, Qatar, for the past 6 or 7 years. So when I saw your call for submissions, it was very pertinent for me because it's a place that seems not particularly contaminated, but the concept of the artificial is everywhere. So it sort of fell into place for me to address it as things that are foreign to a body or a land or just an environment, a nature. It just kind of fell into place. So I don't know, do you want me to speak about what I wrote?
Yes.
Okay, so I started questioning this, how everything, like everyone that comes here tells me this is so artificial, it's an artificial city. Everything seems kind of like it's a very strange place. It seems like a movie set. But then when you start looking into it, at least from where I'm standing, if everything is outside of I took from Mary Douglas's concept of dirt as matter out of place, and that made me, my body, dirt in an environment where I did not belong. And so I took it from an ethnographic insight that I got from a woman that mentioned plastic on the beach is matter out of place. So I told her, but why? How do you reach this conclusion? Like, she says, no, because she was criticizing human veracity, which is also very evident here in resource appropriation and use and waste. And she says, it's like other animals, everyone appropriates things from nature and they kind of give it back. But humans don't, they borrow and they never give it back. So that's where the contamination starts, in the breaking of the cycle. So from there, I took on the concept of care from Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, and some feminist theory, and how we've created this kind of monster, and how it might be helpful to think of this monster, this contamination, these things that we have borrowed and we have not returned to the cycle, as a monster that we now have to care of, like Dr. Frankenstein's monster. So that's basically the idea that I deal with on the paper that I wrote. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Maybe what I found really insightful in your paper was how you distincted between soil and dirt. Maybe you can say one word about that before we move on. From soil and dirt.
Well, yes, it comes from the same. Well, I spoke a bit of composting and giving back, and how this, if you give back, the soil is not necessarily, it's not dirt, in fact, because it stays in this cycle of materials that are borrowed and are composted and are given back to the earth. I dealt a little bit with the way we dispose of human bodies, which is also, I see as like the final proclamation of not giving back, is putting ourselves in sealed boxes, like Tupperware containers, where you do not give back to the earth, whereas you could go back to the cycle and become a seed that becomes soil eventually, and not dirt as matter out of place, because a metal box with a body inside is matter out of place when it's underground, in a way.
Speaking about the way we, or in some Western places, like funerals are conducted, just to clarify.
Well, in most of the world, really.
Yeah. True. I mean, I would love to come back to this. I think there's so much more to unpack in your paper, but we can also move on to Jeppe, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
So do you hear me? Yeah, you do. I think I'm unmuted myself. So I'm speaking from Copenhagen geographically, and I did my studies in anthropology, so that's my disciplinary background. And throughout my studies, I have been quite interested in questions of materiality, materials, and value. And it's for that reason that I have written this article on the concept of imitation. So I discuss in this article the concept of material imitation, which I define as the manipulation of material in such a way as to render it similar to another material in look, touch, shape, or other perceivable quality. And more concretely, I'm dealing with this these products, laminate tabletops, that are basically cheap wood products that are coated in a sort of a hard-wearing surface and coated with some print to imitate another material. Usually it's wood, but it could also be stone or metals. And so the reason why this has something to do with contamination is that I think of the experience of realizing that something is an imitation. I think of that as an experience of something being contaminated. In this case, it is not a sort of external conflict like plastic on a beach, but it's a conflict within an object, that it isn't what it presents itself as. There's sort of there is this duality in the object itself, which also I'm also drawing on Mary Douglas, which can lead one to experience it as contaminated when you realize that it is dual in this way. And I first became interested in this concept of material imitation when I saw these things, new construction projects in major cities like Copenhagen or Amsterdam that have brickwork facades, so they look like they are sort of built by masons or something like that. But you soon realize that actually they are concrete constructions that are just covered in an external facade to imitate another form of construction. And when I became interested in this concept, I just started seeing imitation everywhere, like food packaging, phones, electronics, drinking bottles. And in my apartment in Amsterdam as well, which was this like studio for students with a laminate tabletop, the floor was laminate, there was this bookshelf which was laminate. So I just started becoming super interested and also sort of disgusted by all of these imitations. So imitations basically raise this interesting question about value, which is that, of course, printing a surface on some product like a tabletop, like making it seem like wood, even if it isn't, or even if it's another form of it's leftovers from the production of other things made of wood. So the question is that if you coat a product like that with some print to make it seem like another material, it doesn't increase its physical value. So I'm making this simple distinction between physical and symbolic value. It doesn't alter the physical properties of a tabletop if you paint it basically with a print. But it turns out that it adds some sort of symbolic value. Well, actually, these laminate tabletops are quite good. Like they're very hard wearing, they don't stain, you can easily clean them and so on. So they present good physical value in a sense, like they work well. But for some reason, producers have to sell them as imitations to add some sort of symbolic value to them that is not in them in their sort of original material state. And I find that quite often, well, we don't really notice these imitations, but when we notice that they are imitations, when we are made aware of this incongruence, we can actually, it can be quite shocking. It can be quite a shock. It can even be disgusting, I would argue. So for instance, I had this friend in Amsterdam. He had an apartment with a nice floor. He loved that floor. He told me he had never been as happy with the floor before. But it was a laminate floor, and I was sort of crawling down on the floor, looking at it, figuring out what it was made of. And when I told him it was a laminate floor, he was shocked. Like we ended up in an actual discussion, basically, because he wouldn't believe that it was not a real wood floor. So I think this is quite fascinating. And in the article, I sort of go into the different techniques by which producers and sellers try to transform the product, in this case tabletops, the materiality of those tabletops into something else. And they do that basically by two means: by the sort of material means, that is by like giving it a print. They go to quite some lengths to really convince people that these are made of other materials. So on the edge of the tabletop, there's another print with another pattern that sort of imitates end grain of wood, and this coating, that it has this hard sort of plastic coating, basically also often comes with some texture that imitates the real texture of wood. So it's quite an advanced sort of imitation. And also on the websites of these producers and sellers, they use some sort of discursive strategies that really they don't necessarily lie about the nature, the material nature of the product, but they don't put it straightly what it actually is made of. They sort of they use some discursive strategies to present it as something that it isn't really. So I think that is a really I think it's really interesting the lengths that people go, that sellers and producers go to really turn these products into something else. And that's the positive side of it, that when successful, the process of material imitation really manages to transform something into something else. But this duality that is implied in transforming something into something different, it can also become contaminated when you realize that it has this duality within it. So basically, that's my argument in this article.
Thank you, Jeppe. Maybe next is Ayub.
Yes. So hi, I'm Ayub Tenawi. I'm streaming from Amsterdam right now, so also in the lovely weather. I'm an RMA student at the UvA at the cultural analysis program, and I did a bachelor in English language and culture prior, also at the UvA. I remember like in 2019 when I saw the post of Soapbox for Contamination for the issue. I remember looking at it and thinking, I'm not going to have any time for this, and then I don't have any good ideas for it either, so it's definitely not going to be my thing. But then months later, during the COVID pandemic, there was a sort of serendipitous occasion, I guess, where one of the term papers I had just written happened to be about allergy. So the contamination in my paper is a very literal kind of contamination dealing with a more traditionally understood contaminant, an allergen, and a person who's contaminated, the person who suffers from allergy. But the approach I took in my term paper, which then I suppose was contaminated by Soapbox and turned into an article, was this biosemiotic approach, which I drew very much from the works of Wendy Wheeler. My argument was mostly, or my aim was mostly, to provide an analysis of allergy, both from a biological perspective and look at how the biological processes of allergies can be understood as sign processes in a sort of semiotic perspective, but also to look at the phenomenological side of allergy, to look at how it actually is to suffer allergy, also through the same lens, and then sort of blend these two realms together as the sort of lived experience of allergy and the abstract mechanical, like biological understanding don't seem to mesh very well in like a day-to-day experience. And a sufferer of allergy would not necessarily think about the workings of the immune system in their day-to-day life. So my attempt was to sort of apply a similar lens, and this is the model by Charles Sanders Peirce, which is the semiotic model that I used as opposed to the more popular and influential model by Saussure, which has the signifier and the signified. This model by Peirce has these three different elements to it: an object, a representamen, so the thing that represents the object, and the interpretant, so the effects that the sign has on the person who interprets it. That coupled with sort of Peirce's more dynamic approach, where these elements can switch positions and can be parts of other sort of chains of signs. And Wendy Wheeler's approach, like, I guess, application of this sign in a more, sort of less anthropocentric approach, where she actually studies processes in biology, led me to sort of use this model in my analysis of allergy. And yeah, I think the aim was mostly to sort of show that how looking at both of these perspectives from with the same lens shows the sort of tendency or the sort of parallel between these two very different sign productions, basically, which sort of showcase a new way to look at, or well, I guess a sort of a more holistic perspective to look at allergy or at the human body as sort of something that is biological, that consists of all of these biological processes, biological elements that are porous, that go inside the body, that go outside the body, but also as a sort of system that produces knowledge and that experiences. So yeah, that's what my paper's about.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Ohad, who also works who is a former board member of Soapbox and also very involved in this issue and just published a paper on autoimmunity. I hope you can join our discussion later on this. Maybe let's go over to David. And then we will come back to some points. I feel like there's some more things to unpack.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for, thank you to the Soapbox journal editorial team to give me the opportunity of publishing this paper. I will say about myself that I am an artist, a visual artist. I am a writer, a researcher, a curator, but I like to just say that I'm an artist, period. Like everything that I do is part of the same practice, which I define as art practice. I am based in Rotterdam, but right now I'm speaking from Antwerp. I'm a little bit in between both towns. So already for some time, I've been researching what I call the artist novel. What I call an artist novel is not exactly a novel that is written by a visual artist. It's a little bit more specific. It's those instances in which a visual artist may employ a novel that they create. Sometimes they don't even write it. They use artistic processes to produce the text. They employ the novel not as a literary genre, but as a medium in the visual arts, exactly as another artist could use video, performance, or installation. I hope you can hear me well. I see the lens is a bit dirty, so sorry about that. Maybe I can tweak this a little bit. Well, so for some time now, I've been researching this medium, let's call it a medium in the visual arts, by means of a collaborative project with a curator, Joanna Zelitzka, and we go by the name of the Book Lovers. But this is a practice-based project that, we have created a bibliography of artist novels, a collection of artist novels. They didn't exist before. We have curated exhibitions, performance programs, etc. But there was still lacking some kind of theoretical ground. So at some point, I decided to embark on a PhD, which I did in the Edinburgh College of Art. I completed it in 2018. That was my viva, and I did it with the supervision of Maria Fusco. It was an interdisciplinary research because, whereas I was in the Department of Fine Arts, my second supervisor was from the English literature. So that already points at the hybrid nature of the subject of my research, the artist novel, again, a composite name. So what is quite specific about the artist novel, among many other things, is the fact that it has been obliterated from critical discourse. When I started my research, I couldn't find any book or any article or any reference at all, no exhibitions, like absolutely no knowledge around this kind of practice. With exception of an article published in 2011 by, 10 by Maria Fusco in Metropolis M, the Dutch art magazine. But except that article, there was absolutely no reference. I discovered that the practice has existed at least since the 1990s, with a few pioneer examples before that, but mostly from the 1990s onwards. And yet there was absolutely no critical reflection or not even a reference that this was a thing. So that's what my paper actually is about for this issue of Soapbox. So I divided it in two parts. So it's a kind of compressed because it's not very long, but still I divided it in two parts. The first part tries to situate the practice of the artist novel in the field of the visual arts, not literature. And I also tried to answer the question of why has it been obliterated from, again, critical discourse, not from the practice. The practice existed. I found 571 artist novels by now. But again, there was no reference, no curator, no art historian, no art theoretician, no art critic, nobody even mentioned it by name. So what I write about in my paper is I advance an idea that it is probably caused by influential strand in modernism, which was called medium specificity, led by critic Clement Greenberg, and he advocated for this medium specificity, which basically means that he advised artists to stick to exploration of their own medium. So a painter should explore what painting is about. Sculpture should just deal with sculpture. And he totally hated the idea of mixing different media or disciplines. But he was particularly keen on advising artists to avoid literature like the plague. So he always came up with the same example. He hated the idea that literary contents or notions could be a part of our practice. So I have to say that, he said he placed the horizon of the avant-garde in the idea of purity, that each medium and discipline should explore its own within its own boundaries, uncontaminated by other media. And I have to say that this has been pretty much defining the history of avant-garde art in the 20th century. If you think about performance art in the 60s, it was still the exploration of a medium, even video art, all these things. But by the turn of the century, Rosalind Krauss writes an article, well, actually a book, in which she claims that notions of medium specificity have become obsolete, and then she defines our time by what she calls the post-medium condition, in which artists are not so much, let's say that the use of different media in art is not subordinated to the contents that the artist deals with. So the media, the medium is at the service of whatever content the artist wants to search, to produce. And that opens the door to all kind of, since the purity of the medium is not a thing anymore, it opens the door to all kind of overlapping, reciprocal contamination, hybridizations between different media and disciplines. Of course, I focus on the artist novel as an manifestation of this new, say, historical moment in art history. Because the artist novel has been employed by artists mostly as a vehicle to introduce notions of such as narrative, fiction, identification, imagination, notions that were traditionally ascribed to literature and that had been absent from art production for most of the 20th century, for the most part. So the second part of my paper is I tried that not only to refer to the notions of contamination, hybridization, etc., but I also wanted to offer a piece of text that would perform these contents, to to offer a text that would embody these very contents that I was speaking about. I will try to summarize this because otherwise it would be too long. But with the book lovers, this project I was speaking about, we commissioned the creation of a new artist novel in 2016 to 18, so for 2 years. At the same time, I was doing my PhD, so I decided to take this very commission that we were working with another artist to produce an artist novel. I used it as a key case study and I wrote about it, but the way I conveyed the idea of the process of creation for these 2 years was by means of a narrative text. In other words, half of my thesis is written as a novel. Let's say it's a fictionalization of the process of creation of an actual artist novel where the different agents at play, like the artists, the curators, the editors, the audience, they become characters with their own conflictual desires. So it is not a novel exactly, it is a research written as a novel. So I thought I could, offer an excerpt of this research written as a novel. It follows the conventions of a mystery novel, let's say. And the idea was to have this chapter, which is focused on the narrator reading for the first time the draft of the artist novel he's researching. I wanted to play with the idea of the narrator being an investigator, with the double meaning of this word, that investigator as a detective and as a researcher, right? So as a detective, he proceeds on the text that he's trying to analyze the same way a detective would proceed on a dead body, searching for clues to solve the mystery. So basically, just to finish, yeah, I hope that this second part of my paper presents ideas in a performative way. So it is not only speaking about mixing research and practice. It's not speaking about combining theory and fiction or merging the visual arts and literature, but it's actually doing this in practice. And for me, I think it was a very important point to show that text can operate not only as an expression of research, but also can actually perform the research. But I try to, I think I should leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe to clarify for everyone's understanding who obviously hasn't read it yet, David's piece, as you said, but I will reiterate it, is an excerpt from the artist novel that you just elaborated on, you wrote as part of your thesis. So it really, yeah, is, I guess, partially fictitious, or like it kind of like transcends even the genre description. Yeah, I mean, I think with the four of you, and that also counts for like the rest of the articles, they really operate on so many different scales and like in so many different categories that it was, while at the same time like referring to similar ideas. And like I'm not sure whether it like came through right now because the presentations were quite short, but many of you do write kind of against a certain duality or purity versus contamination binary logic that like is often present like in the situations that you investigate. For example, I don't know, maybe Jeppe, you want to respond to David, because I felt like you didn't mention it in the presentation, but you were speaking about like the hierarchy of materials and like how your research about this kind of apparent drive or urge of sellers and consumers to close the gap between the original kind of wood table and like, or the aspired wood table and the fake laminated tabletop, how that kind of actually reinstitutes like a certain hierarchy of materials. And that really resonated with me when I read David's piece and your kind of stance against medium specificity.
Mm-hmm.
So you're asking what?
I'm asking if you have a response, but I can also ask gently.
Well, I think there are a few different ways of looking at this, because I do realize that sort of insisting on the importance of sort of purity in cultural production is very limiting, and also I think it's clear, at least it's something I've reflected on, that I'm also writing from a perspective, well, a privileged perspective of being someone who has the means to engage in consumption with some sort of regard for well, purity or authenticity or something, and arguing against processes of imitation could be understood basically as an aesthetic from a specific class background, basically. So I don't want to be arguing against imitation, but I think the other perspective is that imitation is not so much a means or technique by which people can say afford something that they find pleasing, but it is also a means for producers and retailers for selling something which is not of particularly good quality, selling it as something else, basically of lowering costs of production. I think that those are perhaps a positive and a negative perspective on imitation. Yeah.
I mean, I feel in your paper you mentioned kind of that it's dependent on a bluff, like kind of for.
Yeah, I think so, and I would say that because what imitation really reveals is not so much something that has to do only with objects of material imitation. It basically reveals a way of evaluating cultural goods at large that tells us that products are valued for the materiality, for the material that they are made of, even if that material doesn't contribute to its physical properties. Like that we actually value, well, floors, tabletops, clothing, or whatever. We lend symbolic value to certain materials, and I think that has to do with where they come from, where they're produced, where they're shipped from, how expensive they are, and so on. So I think that looking into material imitation reveals something about the way that we value products, cultural products at large. Yeah.
But also, I mean, you then define contamination kind of as this moment that you spoke about of, or like that, like this kind of value and how it like unravels in a moment where you feel disgust, or your friend feels like disgust or repulsion by noticing that the floor he like deemed to be authentic wood was a laminated floor in actuality. And yeah, maybe you can like explain a bit more what exactly contamination they're meant for you.
Yeah, so if we accept this idea that which I just put forward, that we basically evaluate things based on their not material properties, but their apparent materiality, what they're made of, then we can understand material imitation as this bluff, basically, that you sort of attempt to short circuit or bypass well, the way that we usually evaluate materials, and that depends on introducing this what do I call it? Introducing this duality. So introducing normally a tabletop doesn't refer to anything other than itself. There is no sort of signifier and signified. Well, maybe there is, but then it's just signifying itself. But as soon as you have something which presents itself as something else, there is a duality. There is a signifier and a signified. You could put it like that. I think with Charles Sanders Peirce, he used the concept of type and token. The token being the object and the type being the category which it belongs to. So this, I think he's an anthropologist, Michael Lempert. He uses these concepts to speak of a differential between the type and token. So this this conflict between what a thing is and what it represents itself as, basically.
Well, to also like move on maybe a bit from the kind of symbolic corruption, because you in your paper you term contamination as kind of the moment where orders of classification become ambiguous, and like that can trigger, you know, like ambiguous feelings as well. But I feel like there's also a very material consequence, maybe something that Susanna was more talking about, and that really becomes evident. And I want to give Susanna also the word again. But in this photo that you send us in the prelude, I'm going to share my screen. Of basically, yeah, maybe you can just briefly explain what this is, and then we can move on to the next question.
That's quite exceptional, I think. So in Amsterdam, there are these regulations in place, as far as I understand, that sort of define the floor as the property of the tenant and not the landowner. So when you move into an apartment, you basically have to bring the floor yourself, which means that when people move out, they throw out the floor. So walking around in Amsterdam, I think that you quite often see these laminate floors. This is a laminate floor that are just put out for trash because it doesn't have any value anymore. So these regulations also mean that people put in, well, cheap floors with laminate, like with a print to make it look like a real wooden floor or something like that, and then they're very easily disposed of again, because actually they're not very good quality. They don't last long, and this obviously leads to a ridiculous use of resources.
And yeah, a waste economy, I think, which we're dealing with. In the prelude to this discussion, I was asking everyone to kind of ponder on the concepts of home, intimacy, and the commons, which are very much interrelated. Maybe as an attempt to, because you've all written the papers like a year ago, so as an attempt to like resituate our conversation more in the like present reality, but also without realizing that actually a lot of you, especially Susanna, like already very much dealt with these concepts in their papers. So I just want to ask maybe a more general question of whether these past months and your experience of being at home, or whatever it has been, like, has changed your views on contamination, on like the whatever you wrote in any kind of way. Susanna, do you want to?
Yes, I'm thinking about it. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. Take your time.
Yes, I mean, of course, I think we all had to think about contamination much more than we had ever thought about it. More than we had ever thought we would have to think about it. In terms of of what I deal with in what I wrote, I think it didn't really change much. But in terms of the place that I am, the concept of home and intimacy and the things that you proposed, of course, it's been interesting to see how the concept of, I'm in a very multicultural city, so it's been interesting to see the different responses of different people, and then local responses, and then the responses to those responses to this crisis, and how, as we have all seen it, you said it at the beginning, it's, even though we all have living bodies and we're living through this crisis, it's a political issue. And I've always seen these countries, I think, are, the way that I see them, it's like big metaphors of the current state of the world, like a very condensed kind of symbol of what's happening, how cities are going to be in this imagined future of progress and further economic accumulation. So in that sense, the way it has also played out with exclusions and the way contamination does not arrive the same way to different people, how everything is really intertwined with the social, with the cultural, even with the deep historical, the deep stories of humanity engaging with each other and how we have structured our relationships with each other. It all keeps playing out in this kind of eternal present that we're living. So that's what I've thought regarding contamination. I think you're muted, Lou.
Does anyone, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll just kind of continue. Also questions of clarification. I mean, I think some of us from the board, we've already read the paper. It's maybe easier to kind of think about it, but maybe someone from the audience like feels like we haven't really covered like contamination critically enough or something, then these interventions are also welcome. Alice? Wait, you're muted as well.
Yeah. No, I just remembered also that in Ayub's paper, there is actually mention of the pandemic. And yeah, one of the more salient points that I thought struck a chord, especially at the time, because I think we received the paper, it would have been first lockdown in April. So we were really all indoors and thinking about this. But it mentioned also just the paranoia associated with allergies, and yeah, that general kind of these new social anxieties that come with sneezing in public, or yeah, just the hypochondria of it. And I thought that was a salient point also of how now something as mundane as an allergy becomes a signifier of risk. And over a year ago, that wouldn't have been the case, or it wouldn't have been, yeah, something to think about.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point also, like just the aspect of kind of performativity and what it can move. So really what David was also speaking about. I mean, I wonder, because actually in this issue, we had a lot of creative contributions. So there's David's novel, there's a contribution by Arvo Leo, who's an artist and filmmaker, set here in Amsterdam, and also a visual essay, which maybe, was kind of a result of the kind of, imprisoning circumstances of the pandemic, but also maybe an understanding that thinking about different forms of contamination or contagion or infection, like always implies a certain invisibility or obscurity, like a difficulty to place it, something that is more sensed than seen, perhaps. And I wonder how, like, maybe more creative, not creative, but like subjective narrative strategies, perspectives, like could are maybe like have to do with that, or like our strategies to sense contamination or something, or like what role that played in in hybridization. Maybe David, like how did writing this novel, how didn't this novel perform you as a subject? Did it contaminate your sense of self?
Yeah, of course, I got to allow myself to to be contaminated in that way. But yes, I think this question is, at least for me, is very important. There has been some experiments in the humanities already for a few decades about trying to go about research. How could I say? For example, in the 1990s, you have a group of anthropologists from Australia who, there is this old problem in anthropology that it has scientific claims, and yet there is a subjective component on the point of view of the observer, of the scientist, of the writer, that cannot be just ignored. And then there is always this suspicion about humanities, like, well, qualitative research is not really research. Yeah, what kind of knowledge are you producing? It's not like hard sciences where things can be really measured. There is always this suspicion that humanities are not able to produce something like knowledge. And then as a possibility of a response, this group of anthropologists in the 1990s, they would embrace these subjective elements rather than try to disguise it or try to deny it. And then they came up with something that it has received many names. I would call it fictocritical writing, but there are many other ways of calling this. So that this, say, the subjective point of view, again, becomes central in the research. I'm explaining a sort of possible origin to this critical writing, but of course there are others in feminist writing, even in art criticism. In Canada in the 70s, well, it doesn't really matter where it originates. The point is fictocritical writing, again, a composite name, yeah, fiction and criticality. It appears as a solution to a problem always. And it is something that in Europe is not very, very present, although I think it's gaining some presence now. I think a lot more in Australia, in Canada, and to some extent in the United States. And I think it's, again, it is not about replacing conventional academic writing, but it is about giving answer to some questions. And you do it, again, embracing all these elements that could be, the ground for, disputing the production of knowledge. But then again, because what I wrote is not a novel, it is research written as a novel. So I make use of conventions that are coming from literature at the service of research. But then, of course, the question is, what kind of knowledge do you produce by doing this? Well, I have my own answer, of course, but this question has to be answered by each researcher who approaches writing methodologically, not as just as a means of expression of a previous work of research. So I think this, regardless of the pandemic, I think it's coming a long way from the recent past in the situation of humanities as a whole. And yeah, I've seen examples in many other disciplines beyond anthropology and visual arts and feminist writing, like I said, but also in sociology, in ethnography. it's kind of gaining a certain momentum. And I think I understand why, you know, again, giving up the pretension of, you know, producing scientific knowledge like hard sciences would do, or quantitative research would do, I think is, you know, it needs not only to be supported by practice, but also by a certain discussion. And so again, I've been very happy to, you know, contribute my little 2 cents to this discussion in this issue.
So essentially, like contamination, or like who is deemed a contaminating agent is like a matter of perspective and hierarchy, but it's a possibility for subversion.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, it can be that, of course. Like I think that is like kind of the struggle of writing, and also the beauty of like these very versatile articles that dabble in so many different disciplines and areas that, for example, in the like last interview, like contamination is really talked about as like in terms of like global waste kind of regimes and the cleanup. One minute, I want to pull up a quote for you. The regimes of yeah, so in Toxic Politics, Acting in a Permanently Polluted World, Liborian referencing Latour and Shotwell states that management via separation, containment, cleanup, and immunization, the hallmarks of 20th century pollution control, are premised on a politics of material purity, which we have also now mentioned a lot, that is no longer available or was never viable to begin with. So I think like this aspect, like we should not forget about kind of. But yeah, I don't know, like we haven't really spoken, I think, about contamination as collaboration much. Maybe if anyone wants to say something about this, or maybe Ohad, you, sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm very curious about your work in autoimmunity and like whether it had any reference to Ayub's paper.
Hi, Lou. Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you. I don't know. I don't have any specific response. I'm sorry for now, but it's so nice to see the faces with which we collaborated, you know, pre-COVID. And this is like the interesting part of this for us that have been working on this issue for a while since COVID started, is that there's this moment before COVID or before contamination and the moment after contamination or after COVID that we're trying to imagine now. But it's not clear what's in the middle, like what are we immersed in all the time? And maybe that is contamination. And like the question is, what in that case is contamination? What are we immersed? What kind of contamination are we immersed in? And then Susanna said something interesting that kind of connected to what I feel is this eternal present. So somehow contamination feels like this eternal present that we're immersed in still. And it's hard to imagine an outside of it because we are being contaminated all the time. And we are within contamination, and we imagine that there was a pre-contamination, right? But I'm not even sure that there was such a situation in which we were, you know, we started also the open call back then, that we have never been like pure, we have never been not contaminated. So there's this I'm a bit confused now. I'm in a confused moment of this publishing it now and seeing everybody again. And yeah, I mean, what at the end is this contamination? Regarding Ayub's paper, no, I think its approach is the right one. Let's call it like that, because he's looking at it from a holistic perspective, the allergy, right? So allergy is not just a misrecognition of something or misrecognition of an exterior threatening object as harmful or not harmful, but he's looking at it as one way to react amongst many different ways. And that holistically is seen as a certain reaction. So allergy started, the definition started as alerted reactivity, I think. But when they used the word in the beginning in 1906, it was just this way to refer to reactivity as such. So it can be reacting against something negative or positive, reacting in this way or that way. But I think the kind of relaxing and nice takeaway from that is that it can encompass all of them somehow, all of these different forms of reacting, and maybe that dictates a certain tolerance to many different ways of reacting. I don't know how this is connected to whatever you were speaking about before, but I found each author really fantastically going into their own research, and I cannot find a red thread yet, but I feel it's I feel it's there, and maybe it's this idea of being contaminated, like we are in this eternal present of, especially now also with the Zoom and everything feels like an airport of great ideas, and I don't know, I feel contaminated, but at the same time hopeful, because it feels like this eternal present. That would be ridiculous. Yeah,
rude maybe.
Maybe a hope, because like Susanna calls it eternal present, and eternity, there is some kind of idea of hope also. So it's like a hopeful thing, you know, this eternity. If we can, maybe we can survive eternally being contaminated somehow. I don't know. I have no idea. Sorry. I'm just like, I was really inspired by all the different authors. And also I like this idea of contaminated tabletops now even more than before, because now I understand what you were getting at. And it's really cool, I think. I just don't know how to extract more from it, but I think it's really nice. Yeah. Sorry, I went on a rant.
Thank you so much. Like, that's why I've been like calling it a conversation. Like, thanks for joining. Thanks for giving us you're taking it and like also bringing this to this personal perspective, because I think it's super important. And also there is a red thread. There is like, indeed, like maybe that's also the, like, it really reflects cultural analysis. I think the choice that like all of these papers are in very different directions, but reading them again, like consecutively, they really complement each other, and you can find out by pre-ordering it. We posted a link on the very top. This is not the complete end of this conversation, but just so you know, there is a link to our shop. So if you want to, of course, not for the authors, but everyone else who's joining, if you want to pre-order it, you can do it there. I think there was maybe to like kind of end on a more hopeful note. Alice, did you want to say something about?
Yeah, just because you brought up contamination as collaboration, and maybe out of context, but maybe it deserves some context. But just to say that when we thought of the theme of contamination, which honestly was just pure coincidence because it came up 3 months before the pandemic, but I think a couple of us at least had Anna Tsing on our minds. And I had just read fully for once the Mushroom at the End of the World, so on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. And we were really coming from a place that, I think was kind of in this hopeful staying with the trouble kind of mode, where the idea of contamination as collaboration, which is the title of the second chapter in Anna Tsing's book, the ideas of contamination as contaminated diversity and of world building. And so I think what was really jarring in March last year, when we felt the effects of the pandemic, because it didn't start then, but when suddenly being confined to indoor spaces, we were all thinking with it, is that suddenly it almost felt for a moment a bit problematic to think of contamination in that way, because it was endowed with so much more with a logic of care and of risk, and also of distance, actually. So the happenings that Tsing talks about, where contamination is a gathering, and these events are produced from it, they actually weren't happening. And so in a way, for a while, it seemed like it was contradicting a lot of the places that we were coming from with contamination, and suddenly urgency and even just concern was trumping these more hopeful thoughts that we had. But I'm glad to hear from Ohad that not all hope is lost, because on the other hand, I'm also interested in the fact that I feel like a year ago we were talking about the event of contamination as being a possibility of world building, in the sense that we saw things happen to chains of distribution to infrastructure to the way things function, we saw them halt in ways that we didn't think were possible before. And I felt at the time that, yeah, there was these, Bruno Latour had this piece about the dress rehearsal and how this was the rehearsal for climate crisis. And there was this kind of moment where we're like, oh, we can, this is the moment to do things differently. But then a year later, it's fallen back into kind of, the same patterns that we always know of how things kind of, unfold under capitalist conditions, and in the same, if not worse, actually worsened dynamics of precarity. So I am glad to hear that, there is some hope in all that, because I've obviously been thinking maybe on the opposite end of the hopeful spectrum. But and also I think I did also have something to say briefly about, so you're talking about the intimacy of inside spaces, and something that we were definitely thinking with a year ago also was the sudden kind of, I mean, we were all probably addicted to screens before this, but it was the sudden also jarring intervention of Zoom and Jitsi and Google Hangouts and all these platforms into our lives, and also a new vocabulary that kind of emerged. Again, is not new, but there's this vocabulary of care that kept seeping out into our online communications. And I also want to emphasize how nice Soapbox is as an object. And our designers, Cecil and Stepan, have just done such a surprising and good, they've just made such a beautiful paper object that will print very soon. And in it, they've inserted kind of this digital language of, they've used a lot of emojis. They have their own chapter that you can see here. I feel like I'm not going to do justice if I explain it, but there is an explanation and you can read it in the issue when it comes out. But they wanted to play on how much we've been spending time communicating online specifically. And for example, on the cover, you'll see a message from them that says, I hope you're well. And on the back cover, it says, take care. Even on the poster for today's conversation, it said all the best, because they're just these formalities that have kind of amplified in meaning at a time where everyone is thinking of other people's health. So telling people to take care just, suddenly means a whole lot more. And we've got a chapter from Arvo Leo also that I'm really looking forward to seeing in print. So that was to talk about the kind of the intimate spaces and the fact that maybe we felt that our daily lives were a bit contaminated with endless Zoom discussions, which I realize the irony of right now, but I just wanted to speak to that.
Thanks. We have one question from the audience. It's by Kim. She has a dog, so I will read it for her. Right? Okay. So thinking about contamination in relation to the concept of hybridity, the latter usually still implies a certain duality or multiplicity. So even though it refers to a unit, singular phenomenon, it is one that contains two or more entities, ideas, etc. When thinking about David Marotto's practice in particular, I feel like the artistic/curatorial and literary practice become one and the same. If I had to think of it as an image, it would make me think of a Mobius strip, where the whole unit consists of two sides, or differences, if you may. How far would you, David, argue that your incorporation or adoption of these different practices actually create new ones? And a question directed to all the authors. Would you think of contamination as hybridity, the unification of multiplicities, or not?
Should I go first? Hello, should I go first?
Yes.
Okay. I just started introducing myself as an artist, just simply. But if you start to look inside, I do a lot of stuff that, in other cases, they define somebody's profession or somebody's identity. Am I a curator? No. Do I curate? Yes. I think I'm rather an artist who curates sometimes, the same way that sometimes I write and sometimes I do other things, but neither of them defines what I do. So that's why I try to simplify everything as, just being an artist. One of the things that led me in the first place to start my research was the impossibility to situate my practice in the field of the visual arts. When for the first time I wrote a novel, when I didn't really write it, I created a novel as part of an art project 10 years ago. Everybody thought I became a novelist. And I couldn't explain why I was an artist who was using a novel, because again, there was no critical vocabulary available to me. Again, there was no knowledge produced around the practice exists, obviously, but I didn't even know how to speak about it in artistic terms, not literary. And so what I want to say is that all these kind of different positions I have to take within my own practice are out of necessity. It's not a statement or anything. I'm just putting the position where my own practice leads me. And then I find out that I'm doing something that many other artists do, but is not considered art, but literature. But I know I'm not doing literature. So I have to find out the words, the critical vocabulary that allows me to speak out my own work. And in so doing, I realized I was also, being of help to many other artists who were in the same situation. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but at least this is how I would see what I do in a very general way.
Thank you. I see people are being. Does anyone else want to respond to the more general question? Do you think contamination as hybridity?
Yeah, I can think of something. As part of what I've been researching here is the nature-culture split, which has seemed very, like, it's really, I feel it more put to your face when you arrive in a place like this, even though it's just as harsh everywhere else. It's easier to see. So I think this notion of contamination, like its underlying base comes from the nature culture split, because so long as there are humans and nature, then there's a mix. Whereas if you think about it another way, we could just say, everything is materials. So nothing can get contaminated if it is all the same substance. But if you keep having these binaries and especially this nature culture split, which is being questioned right now, but in the everyday, I believe it's even in the language that we use, it's very hard to get rid of it. So I think this notion ultimately comes from that split between humans and nature, or the artificial. Whatever we touch that becomes artificial suddenly can become contamination.
Yeah. And that it's like always also very perspective dependent. Or do you describe it really beautifully in the beginning, I think, of your text, that the crabs and like fish maybe and animals that look up to these like monstrous skyscrapers on like an artificial island, like that for them this is not belonging there, maybe, while they do belong. While of course a family who is living in these houses, for them this is the home and the place of belonging. So these like the categories of belonging are always also ambiguous, or like a matter of scale and perspective. Does anyone else want to say something? Otherwise, I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Soapbox board, the, let's say, former one, as well as the new Soapbox board. And I really want to thank as well Stepan Lipatov and Cecil Müller, who are the designers and who, like, yeah, I have to say, reading it in a designed version is a completely different experience. Like, it really changes, alters almost the text. So I'm really excited for all of you to receive it and have it as a physical copy in your hand. I think by now we're almost among soapboxers only. Yeah. Thanks also to Jeff. He's not here anymore, and all the other peer reviewers. I think this kind of concludes our session. Please give a warm applause for the speakers and yourself. This is so weird, like a silent applause. But yeah, I'm very happy that we pulled it off together, and I'm very much looking forward to the next issue, which will probably come out around summer or September, which is also very exciting on Impasse. But yeah, we'll be in touch, I think. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.